All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. This has been a blockbuster couple of weeks in college football as we've seen the demise of the Pac 12 with Oregon and Washington going to the Big Ten, while Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah are set to join the recently departed Colorado in the Big 12. And once you factor in USC and UCLA committing to the Big Ten last year as well, the Pac 12 is all but done. So now we're looking at an 18 team Big Ten next year, while the SEC will be at 16 when Oklahoma and Texas join. And then the Big 12 is going to be at 16, and then the ACC at 14. Now, it was a game changer a little bit more than 30 years ago when the SEC added South Carolina and Arkansas to bring them to 12 teams, as that paved the way for the first conference game and conference championship game, rather. And you think back to where conferences were in college football, about 30 years ago or so. It was a big deal when the Big Ten added Penn State to make it 11 teams. You think about the ACC in those days, they were a 9 team league after they added Florida State. The Pac 10, they were obviously just 10 teams at the point. You still had the Big Eight conference, you still had the Southwest Conference as well. And now, obviously, things have really changed as there's just basically four leagues calling the shots in college football. And of course, two leagues are head and shoulders above the others. And I'm talking about both the Big Ten and the SEC. And of course, the SEC, they had the first conference championship game. And when they did it, we thought that the leagues they would stop at 12 teams. And, obviously that was the case in the mid 90s. You saw the Big Eight form with several teams from the Southwest Conference, such as Texas, to form the Big 12. The ACC began gutting the Big East about 20 years ago, and then they got to 12 teams for an ACC championship game. And then we saw, when things were starting to unravel for the Big 12, when Nebraska jumped ship to the Big Ten and they had 12 teams. But obviously now we have gone light years ahead of that, because now we're talking about 18 team college football leagues, and at some point it's going to be 20. But you just have to ask yourself, when is enough going to be enough? I say this because rivalries are what make a sport, regardless of the sport. It's all about the rivalries. And it is going to be so difficult for these mega conferences to maintain rivalries because there are only so many games that you can play in a year, regardless of the sport. Let's just jump ship for a minute and talk basketball here. Now we're going to be talking about an 18 team Big Ten. Usually, most leagues, conferences, they have about 20 games for basketball. So you're not going to have, the typical home and away, like we've seen for so many years in basketball. And of course, the Big Ten is not the first conference to go this big. I mean, it was after the Big East was losing football schools, they started to add some more basketball schools. And by the mid 2000s, the Big East basketball wise was a 16-team league. It worked due to the fact that the Big East was so strong in basketball. But of course, they weren't the same football. They never have been. But now, we're talking about an 18-team league for basketball, and of course, other sports as well. It's going to make it very difficult, and I'll touch on those other sports in a little bit. But just look for an example here, and I've talked about this before, and I'll say it again right now. The SEC, even though that Texas and Oklahoma are set to join next year, this league still refuses to go to a 3-3-6 format where you would get three common games every year with a conference opponent while everybody else would rotate, and that would allow the conference the opportunity to preserve some rivalries, but instead, the SEC is not on board with it because, more people in that conference are more worried about having an additional cupcake game in order to become bowl eligible. But in the process, the rivalries are going to continue to die. You think about the current SEC, Alabama LSU is a big game in the SEC West. Georgia Auburn is a big game. Florida Georgia is a big game. Florida Tennessee, Alabama Tennessee. I can just keep rattling them off. We're not going to see these games as frequent, as we did once upon a time. Already, we're not seeing them as frequent because every time that you expand the conference, these games are coming around less and less. You think about the Big Ten, of course, they're going away from the East-West format once USC, Oregon, Washington, and UCLA join next year. But guess what? When you think about Big Ten football, you naturally, gravitate to Ohio State and Michigan, and by far, it is one of the most iconic rivalries football wise, not just at the collegiate level, but football, in this country, whether it's the college or the National Football League. But there's also some other rivalry games that are caught up in that mix. You think about Wisconsin, Iowa, you think about Ohio State, Penn State. That has been a big game since the Nittany Lions joined the Big Ten. And of course, it's been bigger since the Buckeyes and the Nittany Lions are in the same division or have been in the same division rather in the Big Ten. That could get lost in the wash as well. And then let's not talk about rivalries that have already been lost through realignment. You think about some games that are going to be extinct after this year. No more Apple Cup. And if you're not in the Pacific Northwest, I get it. But that's a big game right there between Washington and Washington State. I know, and I talked about this before, Bedlam has been one-sided over the years in favor of Oklahoma as opposed to Oklahoma State. But don't tell the folks in Stillwater or Norman that that game is not important. That's going to be a thing of the past. You think about the Civil War, Oregon and Oregon State, and that has been a big game, especially over the last 25 years. I go back to maybe like 2000, I believe, when the Ducks needed to win that game to get to the BCS championship game and win the Pac-10, and the Beavers beat them, and then of course, Washington went to the Rose Bowl, and then of course, Oregon State went to the Fiesta Bowl and beat Notre Dame, and then a good Oregon team had to settle for the Holiday Bowl against Texas, which wasn't bad, but the Holiday Bowl payout isn't a Fiesta Bowl or Rose Bowl bid payout there. You think about Missouri, Kansas, not just on the football field, but especially on the hardwood, because that was a big deal going back to when both of these teams were in the Big Eight conference. You think about USC, Stanford, regardless of the sport, it's always been a big deal. Pitt, West Virginia, with their backyard brawl, it's gone. And of course, there are so many others. So, it's just one of those, so many teams to go through in order to win a conference now as well. That's a big thing because you're looking at it from the money standpoint if you're a school administrator. I totally get it. I understand that aspect of it. And I know that you can say that, maybe winning the conference is not going to be as big of a deal now due to the fact that, hey, you got the college football playoff. Obviously, everybody that gets to the playoff is not going to be a conference champion. I totally get it. But you just think of how many teams, you have to decipher through. And you look at the National Football League and as an example, 32 teams, two conferences, you go through 16 teams. Okay, I get it. You have a 17 game schedule. You play everybody in your division twice. Okay, so that's 6 games right there, 5 against the AFC or NFC, whatever way you break it down, and then 2 against every other division. But the thing is, you still kind of get a feel for teams, even though there are some games that have been lost through realignment in the NFL. Don't get me wrong, but it's still more of a common ground as far as getting to the postseason, and of course trying to strive to get the Super Bowl championship. But here in these 16 and 18 team leagues, there's no way possible that you could face everybody, and I think that to me, I think takes away from it. We're not going to see a Michigan play in Iowa, that frequently. We already don't see it as much as we used to. We're not going to see a Penn State play in Minnesota that frequently. We're not going to see Rutgers play, a USC that frequently. Whatever way you want to slice it. And to me, that's what conference is all about. It's all about playing guys or playing teams and schools consistently. And I think that is something that has completely gotten lost in the wash. Excuse me, with these mega conferences. And obviously all of these moves are football driven. I totally get it. I totally understand it. But the people that are clamoring for that, they also have to factor in the travel, not just for football, but for other sports. I mean, just think about it. Imagine having to go from the West Coast or the East Coast or vice versa just to have a conference baseball game, just to have a conference tennis match, you name it. And the thing is, if you're not playing in a sport that drives in the money like basketball or football, guess what? Your amenities as far as traveling are not on the same level as they're going to be for football and basketball. It's already tough enough, for some of these other teams, if they're in an SEC to travel from one school to another. It might be a bus, train, whatever. The same thing for the Pac 12, same thing for, the Big Ten pre expansion. Now, what's it going to be? I mean, if you're on the tennis team and you're at Northwestern, you know what? Good luck trying to get to Maryland, or good luck trying to go out west to UCLA or Washington, you name it. And these are the things, again, that people really don't factor in. And another thing as well, we focused so much on trying to regulate the NIL. We focus so much on trying to regulate, the transfer portal and transferring. But I'll tell you like this, not just in this round of realignment, but the previous rounds of realignment over the last 10 years or so. How many conversations, how many calls, how many inquiries were there from a school that was already committed to one conference and there was another conference they were already talking turkey with? How often does that happen? And of course, nobody has said a word. And like I've said before, and I'm going to continue to say this, and I'm going to continue to beat the drum on this. This is what happens when you don't have a legit governing body calling the shots. And that's something that the NCAA doesn't do. I've also talked about the need for revenue sharing at the collegiate level, but good luck getting all of these school presidents and administrators across the board to agree to it. You look at it, like I said last week, another great conference has fallen. And this is going to be the same sentiment every single time that this happens. Because if you think that this is going to stop at the Pac 12 folding, then you just think again in another 5 or 10 years. But this is what happens when you have greed. This is what happens when you have a lack of leadership at so many levels, whether it's the conference level, whether it's the NCAA level. And this is what happens once again when you don't have revenue sharing at the pro level. I'm going to keep asking this question. How long before we have a 20 and a 25 team college football conference? It's going to happen sooner than you think because, again, the SEC and the Big Ten, respectively, are the gold standard as far as getting deals done and getting that football money for their members. So, as long as other schools who feel slighted by what they're getting in their respective conferences see that, guess what? They're going to do whatever they feel necessary to get a piece of that pie. So, it's only going to be a matter of time because you're already seeing the writing on the wall with Florida State and possibly Clemson in the ACC. And I guarantee you, the next time around, when we're talking about TV deals for the conferences, I guarantee you, some of these Big 12 schools are going to look and see what the SEC is getting, and they're going to see what the Big Ten is going to get, and they're going to say, "Hey, you know what? We want a piece of that as well." Especially being that the game has changed, because back in the day, you got your TV money based off of how you produced on the field because the better that you were, the more that you were on the field. Now things have changed and everybody's getting an equal piece of the pie, if you will. And no disrespect to Northwestern, no disrespect to Rutgers or Vanderbilt or schools like that. But guess what? When they're getting twice as much as a USC or they're getting twice as much as an Oklahoma, that for football, that right there causes a problem. And now we're seeing it right now, of course, with Florida State and possibly Clemson and others in the ACC. So, with that said, it's only going to be a matter of time before we get to 20, and it's not going to be that much longer after that before we get to 25. And of course, the question is going to be, when will enough be enough? It's one of those where at some point in my lifetime, unless there is an immense amount of regulation coming down the pike, it might just be two or three super mega conferences, and it's going to be everybody else. That is what we're barreling to. I think that people need to give credit more to the pro leagues as far as the revenue sharing, luxury taxes, whatever they have to do to keep it somewhat of a level playing field for everybody, because it's kind of like a checks and balances thing. You don't have checks and balances collegiately, and this thing, it I can't say it's gotten out of control. It's been out of control, but I think it's out of control right now on steroids as we have coast to coast conferences. And for football, it's one thing, but you have to think about and you have to factor in the other sports. And of course, most people really are not doing it. It's one of those where this is a state of the game. I know that some people are going to say, well, you're still going to watch football. Absolutely. But you also have to factor in the other sports. And at the end of the day, there's going to be teams that are going to get lost in the wash. Oregon and Washington and USC and UCLA going to the Big Ten, football wise, people are going to pay attention to it. But guess what? Everybody, you're going to have people that are definitely going to watch USC. You're going to have people that watch Oregon. They're going to watch Washington. Of course, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. But some of those other games, the Illinois Purdue game, for an example, is going to get pushed even further down in the pecking order. You look at the SEC once Texas and Oklahoma come in, the Vanderbilt LSU game is going to get pushed even further down the pecking order, even though I don't foresee Vanderbilt and LSU playing each other that often, which again is an issue with these mega conferences. I don't know what it's going to take for things to change, but at some point, something has to give. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365 that you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So, once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin, and I am signing off. And I'm saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.